The most dangerous lie isn't the one told under oath. It's the one spoken by someone convinced a badge makes it untouchable. The federal courthouse stood beneath a gray morning sky, its marble steps still damp from the rain that had swept through before dawn. Lawyers hurried through the revolving doors with briefcases pressed against their sides. Reporters adjusted camera tripods near the entrance. Deputies exchanged quiet greetings as they prepared for another day that, on paper, looked routine. Inside courtroom 7, every seat was nearly occupied. The case had already attracted local attention. Officer Ethan Walker, a veteran police officer known for his confident courtroom testimony, was scheduled to testify in a misconduct hearing connected to a disputed arrest months earlier. Most people expected another predictable proceeding. A respected officer would answer a few questions, the paperwork would be reviewed, and everyone would go home believing the system had worked exactly as intended. No one expected the truth to be waiting quietly in the second row. Naomi Brooks entered without drawing attention to herself. She wore a simple navy blazer over a white blouse, carrying only a leather portfolio that looked no different from those held by dozens of attorneys walking the courthouse halls each day. Her expression revealed little. She acknowledged no curious glances, spoke to no one, and calmly took her seat near the front of the gallery. If anyone noticed her at all, they quickly looked away. To them, she was simply another observer. Ethan Walker noticed her immediately. His eyes lingered for only a second before he dismissed her with the casual certainty of a man accustomed to making instant judgments. He leaned toward another officer seated nearby and whispered something that earned a quiet laugh. Naomi heard it. She gave no reaction. That silence somehow irritated Ethan more than any argument could have. When the clerk called the courtroom to order, everyone rose. The judge entered, thanked the jury for their attendance, and reminded every witness that honesty under oath remained the foundation of justice. Those words echoed through the room. Honesty. Justice. Responsibility. Ethan repeated the oath without hesitation. Then he took the witness stand. His uniform was perfectly pressed. His badge reflected the courtroom lights as though polished only moments earlier. He spoke with practiced confidence, answering introductory questions in a calm, measured voice that projected reliability. To anyone meeting him for the first time, he looked exactly like the kind of officer people were taught to trust. Then his eyes drifted toward Naomi once more. "There she is," he said, loud enough for several people nearby to hear. "The woman who's been trying to interfere with this investigation." The room shifted almost imperceptibly. Several heads turned. The prosecutor looked toward Naomi. She remained seated. "I've seen her around before," Ethan continued. "She keeps showing up where she doesn't belong." His words carried weight. Not because evidence supported them, but because they came from a man wearing a badge. Whispers spread through the gallery. A reporter scribbled another line into a notebook. One juror glanced toward Naomi with visible uncertainty. Still, she didn't respond. She simply folded her hands together and watched Ethan continue speaking. There was no anger in her eyes. No embarrassment. Only patience. It was the kind of patience that comes from someone who already knows how the story ends. Ethan mistook it for weakness. He smiled. He had no idea that every sentence leaving his mouth was becoming part of something much larger than the trial itself. Somewhere beyond the courtroom doors, a small team waited quietly. No flashing lights. No dramatic entrance. Just professionals watching a carefully timed operation move exactly as planned. Inside the courtroom, everyone believed Officer Ethan Walker was exposing a liar. Outside, a different truth was already closing in. By the time this hearing ended, the question would no longer be whether Naomi Brooks belonged inside that courtroom. The real question would be why Officer Ethan Walker had chosen to lie in front of the one person who had spent months documenting every step that led him there. The courthouse had awakened long before sunrise. By 8 o'clock. Its marble corridors echoed with measured footsteps, quiet conversations, and the soft rustle of legal files changing hands. Security officers watched every entrance with practiced indifference while reporters gathered near the courtroom doors, sensing that today's hearing might produce another headline before the afternoon was over. To everyone else, it was simply another federal proceeding. To Naomi Brooks, it was the final move of a game that had begun months earlier. She arrived alone. No escort. No display of authority. Nothing about her appearance invited attention. A navy blazer, a modest leather portfolio, and a calm expression allowed her to disappear into the steady flow of attorneys and witnesses moving through the building. Exactly as planned. She paused briefly beneath a bronze seal mounted high above the entrance to Courtroom 7. The words engraved around it, "Equal justice under law," caught her attention for only a moment before she continued inside. The irony wasn't lost on her. Justice often depended on who controlled the story. Inside the courtroom, Officer Ethan Walker laughed with two fellow officers near the witness stand. His confidence filled the room before he spoke a single word. Years of successful testimony had taught him that juries tended to trust uniforms first and ask difficult questions later. He believed today would be no different. He never noticed the older man reading a newspaper 3 rows behind him. He overlooked the young woman typing quietly on a tablet beside the courtroom entrance. He ignored the maintenance worker adjusting a security camera outside the hallway. Each of them had a purpose. None of them were there by accident. Naomi chose a seat where she could observe every face in the room without attracting unnecessary attention. She opened her portfolio just enough to review a few handwritten notes before closing it again. She already knew every answer Ethan intended to give. That certainty didn't come from instinct. It came from evidence. Across the courtroom, Assistant U.S. Attorney Daniel Reeves reviewed the witness schedule with the judge's clerk. Neither man acknowledged Naomi. That silence was intentional. The fewer people who appeared connected to her, the smoother the morning would unfold. The bailiff called for everyone to rise. Conversation stopped immediately. The judge entered, adjusted his glasses, and welcomed the jury before reminding every witness that false testimony carried serious legal consequences. The warning lingered in the quiet room. For a brief second, Naomi wondered whether Ethan had heard it at all. Then he smiled confidently as his name was called. He walked toward the witness stand without hesitation, shoulders squared, uniform immaculate, every movement projecting certainty. He looked like a man who expected complete control over the next hour. Naomi watched him carefully. Not with anger. Not with fear. With patience. Months of surveillance had taught her something important about Ethan Walker. He wasn't careless because he lacked intelligence. He was careless because he believed no one would ever challenge his version of the truth. That belief had protected him for years. Today, it would become his greatest mistake. As Ethan settled into the witness chair, sunlight pushed through the tall courtroom windows, casting narrow bands of light across the polished wooden floor. Outside, the city carried on without realizing that inside this quiet courtroom, two very different stories were about to collide. One story had been built on confidence. The other had been built on evidence. Before the morning was over, only one of them would survive. Officer Ethan Walker adjusted the microphone with the relaxed confidence of someone who believed the room already belonged to him. The defendant's account doesn't match what actually happened, he said, his voice steady enough to persuade anyone hearing only the surface of his testimony. I've spent 17 years protecting this city. I know how to recognize suspicious behavior. Several jurors nodded almost instinctively. Experience carried weight. A badge carried even more. Naomi Brooks remained perfectly still. She watched Ethan the same way an experienced chess player watches an opponent commit to an aggressive move too early. Every sentence he offered narrowed his own options, though he seemed completely unaware of it. The prosecutor asked another question. So you're certain the woman seated in the gallery attempted to interfere with your investigation? I'm absolutely certain, Ethan replied without hesitation. She approached witnesses. She observed restricted conversations. Frankly, she had no legitimate reason to be anywhere near this case. His answer echoed through the courtroom. A quiet murmur spread among the spectators. Someone near the back whispered that the woman should probably be questioned. Another shook his head, convinced the officer had already settled the matter. Naomi neither protested nor defended herself. Her silence was deliberate. Across the aisle, Judge Harold Benson studied the courtroom over the rim of his glasses. He noticed Naomi's composure but said nothing. His attention returned to the witness stand as Ethan continued describing events with remarkable certainty. Every detail sounded polished. Every timeline appeared complete. Too complete. Near the courtroom entrance, a court clerk quietly checked the digital clock mounted above the doors before exchanging a subtle glance with another employee. Neither gesture attracted attention. Neither was accidental. Outside the courtroom, two men in business attire stood beside a window overlooking the courthouse plaza. To anyone passing by, they appeared to be discussing paperwork. Instead, one simply asked, "Has he committed?" The other looked toward his watch. "He just did." Inside, Ethan leaned forward. "I've sworn to tell the truth," he declared confidently. "Everything I've testified to today is accurate." Naomi lowered her eyes briefly to the closed portfolio resting on her lap. Inside were documents she had reviewed dozens of times. Interview transcripts. Financial records. Photographs. Internal reports. Evidence collected patiently over months by people who understood that corruption rarely exposed itself overnight. Sometimes it exposed itself one confident lie at a time. The prosecutor thanked Ethan and prepared to move forward. Then something unexpected happened. Judge Benson glanced toward the gallery. "Ms. Brooks," he said calmly, "I understand you've requested permission to address the court if necessary." Every face turned toward her. Even Ethan looked surprised. For the first time that morning, their eyes met directly. He expected anxiety. Perhaps embarrassment. Instead, he found a calm expression that never changed. Naomi rose slowly. She didn't rush. She didn't argue. She simply stood, adjusted her blazer, and looked toward the witness stand with quiet confidence. The courtroom fell into complete silence. No one realized that the hearing had already begun to shift. The testimony everyone believed had strengthened Officer Ethan Walker's position had, in reality, done something far more dangerous. It had filled the final gap in a case that had been waiting months for one voluntary confession disguised as certainty. And Ethan, convinced he had controlled the story from the very beginning, had just handed that final piece to the people who had been listening all along. Naomi Brooks stood without a trace of urgency. The movement itself was almost unremarkable, yet it drew every eye inside courtroom 7. Conversation stopped. Pens paused above legal pads. Even the ceiling fans seemed louder against the sudden silence. Officer Ethan Walker watched her with quiet amusement. He believed she was about to defend herself. He expected excuses. Perhaps outrage. Instead, Naomi simply adjusted the sleeve of her blazer and faced the judge. "Your Honor," she said evenly, "with the court's permission, I'd like to respond to the statements that were just made." Judge Harold Benson gave a slow nod. "You may." Naomi didn't look at the jury. She didn't address the spectators. Her attention remained fixed on Ethan. "I've listened carefully to Officer Walker's testimony," she began. "He stated that I interfered with witnesses, entered restricted areas, and attempted to influence an active investigation." She paused. "Those are serious allegations." Ethan folded his arms with quiet confidence. "They're also completely false." A ripple moved through the gallery. The prosecutor immediately stood. "Objection. She's making an unsupported assertion." Judge Benson raised a hand. "I'll allow her to continue for now." Naomi thanked him with a Slight nod. I have no intention of debating Officer Walker, she continued. Facts don't require arguments. They require verification. Those words lingered in the room. For the first time that morning, Ethan's expression shifted almost imperceptibly. Not fear. Only irritation. He wasn't accustomed to people refusing to engage on his terms. Naomi reached into her portfolio. The spectators leaned forward, expecting documents. Instead, she removed nothing. She simply closed the portfolio again. The gesture puzzled everyone except a handful of people scattered quietly throughout the courtroom. Near the rear exit, the elderly man who had been reading a newspaper folded it neatly and placed it beside him. The woman with the tablet tapped her screen once. A deputy standing outside the courtroom received a silent vibration on his phone. No words were exchanged. No dramatic signal was given. Yet an invisible sequence had begun moving into place. Inside the witness stand, Ethan noticed none of it. He smiled faintly. Is this supposed to impress the court? He asked. Naomi met his gaze. No. Her answer came calmly. It's supposed to clarify the record. The courtroom remained silent. Judge Benson watched both of them carefully, sensing that the hearing had taken a direction no one anticipated. The prosecutor shuffled through his notes, suddenly uncertain whether he was still controlling the examination. Naomi continued. Officer Walker testified under oath that he recognized me from previous encounters. That's correct, Ethan interrupted. You've been following police investigations for months. Naomi neither confirmed nor denied the statement. Instead, she asked a single question. Officer Walker, are you certain that's your final answer? He laughed softly. I don't need to change the truth. Naomi gave a small nod, as though she had been waiting for exactly those words. Very well. She looked toward the judge. Your Honor, I have no further questions at this moment. The simplicity of her response confused nearly everyone. If she possessed evidence, why not reveal it now? If she had been falsely accused, why remain so composed? Only Naomi understood that timing could be as powerful as proof. Sometimes the strongest evidence wasn't the document you presented. It was the lie you allowed someone to repeat until there was no way to take it back. The silence inside courtroom 7 stretched longer than anyone expected. No one moved. No one spoke. Officer Ethan Walker remained in the witness chair, convinced he had regained control simply because Naomi Brooks had chosen not to challenge him immediately. In his experience, innocent people argued. They protested. They demanded to be heard. Naomi had done none of those things. She had only listened. That made her impossible to read. Judge Harold Benson glanced toward the prosecutor. Do you have additional questions for the witness? The prosecutor hesitated. A few moments earlier, the hearing had appeared straightforward. Now an unfamiliar uncertainty had settled over the room. Ethan's testimony sounded convincing, but Naomi's calm confidence suggested there was far more beneath the surface. No further questions at this time, Your Honor. The judge nodded. Before anyone could move to the next witness, Naomi spoke again. May I request permission to submit several exhibits at the appropriate stage of today's proceedings? The request sounded routine. Almost ordinary. Judge Benson studied her for a moment. Do these exhibits relate directly to the testimony we've just heard? They do. And were they properly disclosed? Yes, Your Honor. The judge looked toward the clerk. Very well. They will be marked and reviewed when appropriate. Ethan leaned back with a faint smile. Documents didn't concern him. He had testified hundreds of times. Every investigation produced paperwork. He assumed these would be no different. He couldn't have been more mistaken. Outside the courtroom, an elevator door opened. 2 men in dark business suits stepped into the hallway carrying slim document cases. They walked without urgency, exchanged no conversation, and disappeared into a nearby conference room. Inside, spectators whispered among themselves. Some wondered why Naomi seemed so composed. Others questioned whether Officer Walker had exaggerated his account. The jury remained silent, carefully observing both witnesses. Naomi returned to her seat. She folded her hands and looked toward the witness stand once more. There was no satisfaction on her face. No anger. Only patience. Months earlier, she had learned an important lesson from a senior investigator. People rarely exposed themselves because they were forced to. They exposed themselves because they believed they were safe. Ethan had believed exactly that. Every confident statement he delivered under oath strengthened the timeline investigators had already assembled. Every unnecessary accusation narrowed his own escape. The courtroom clock ticked quietly toward the next hour. Judge Benson reviewed several notes before looking up again. The court will take a brief recess. The gavel struck once. People slowly stood from their seats. Reporters hurried into the hallway. Attorneys gathered in small groups. Ethan stepped down from the witness stand wearing the relaxed expression of a man who believed the difficult part was over. As he passed Naomi, he paused for only a second. "You should have stayed away from this case," he said quietly. Naomi met his eyes. "I was exactly where I needed to be." For the first time that morning, Ethan couldn't immediately think of a reply. He walked away without another word. Naomi watched him disappear through the courtroom doors. Then she glanced briefly toward the conference room across the hall. The investigators had arrived. The evidence was ready. And after the recess, the hearing would no longer revolve around what Officer Ethan Walker claimed to remember. It would revolve around what the evidence had recorded with absolute precision. When the recess ended, the atmosphere inside courtroom 7 had changed. The conversations that had filled the hallway disappeared the moment the judge returned to the bench. Reporters hurried back to their seats. Jurors settled into the jury box. Every eye drifted toward Naomi Brooks, who remained composed as if nothing unusual had happened during the break. Officer Ethan Walker noticed it too. Her confidence no longer looked mysterious. It looked deliberate. Judge Harold Benson adjusted a stack of documents before addressing the courtroom. "Before we proceed, the court has received notice that additional evidence has been submitted for review." Ethan barely reacted. He had testified through countless hearings involving new exhibits. Most of them changed nothing. He expected another routine procedural step. Naomi rose slowly. "Your Honor, with the court's permission, I'd like to clarify my role in the events Officer Walker described." "You may proceed." She stepped forward until she stood several feet from the witness stand. There was no anger in her expression. No triumph. Only quiet certainty. "My name is Naomi Brooks," she began. "For the past 9 months, I have participated in a federal investigation involving allegations of official misconduct." The courtroom became perfectly still. Ethan frowned. He assumed she was referring to someone else's case. Then Naomi reached inside her blazer. Several spectators leaned forward instinctively. She removed a leather credential wallet and placed it carefully on the evidence table. Judge Benson examined it. The prosecutor looked twice. The courtroom clerk stopped writing. Naomi opened the wallet. A gold badge reflected the courtroom lights. Beside it rested a federal identification card. "My assignment," she continued evenly, "has been conducted under the authority of the Federal Bureau of Investigation." The words landed with astonishing weight. A quiet gasp spread through the gallery. One juror looked from Naomi to Ethan, then back again, struggling to process what had just happened. Officer Walker's confident posture disappeared almost instantly. "What?" he whispered. Naomi didn't answer him. She addressed the court instead. "Officer Walker stated under oath that I had no legitimate reason to be present during multiple investigative activities. She paused. In fact, my presence had been formally authorized throughout the operation. The prosecutor slowly lowered the file he had been holding. He had expected a disagreement between witnesses. He had not expected a federal investigator. Judge Benson looked directly at Ethan. Officer Walker, were you aware of Ms. Brooks' official capacity? Ethan swallowed. No. I wasn't. For the first time all morning, certainty abandoned him. The confidence that had filled his testimony only minutes earlier gave way to visible confusion. Naomi continued speaking calmly. I did not approach this courtroom to defend my reputation. She looked briefly toward Ethan. I came to complete an investigation. The statement echoed through the chamber. Outside the tall courthouse windows, sunlight broke through the clouds for the first time that day. Inside, the balance of power shifted without a single raised voice. Officer Ethan Walker had entered the courtroom believing his badge placed him beyond suspicion. Now he faced a far more unsettling reality. The woman he had publicly accused was never an obstacle to justice. She had been documenting his choices, his statements, and his conduct from the very beginning. And the investigation he believed he was describing had always been about him. The revelation settled over the courtroom like a sudden change in weather. No one spoke. The silence was no longer caused by uncertainty. It was caused by realization. Officer Ethan Walker remained frozen beside the witness stand, staring at the FBI credentials lying on the evidence table. Only minutes earlier, he had addressed Naomi Brooks as though she were an inconvenience. Now every assumption he had made was collapsing under the weight of a single fact. She had never wandered into his investigation. She had been leading one of her own. Judge Harold Benson leaned forward. Ms. Brooks, he said evenly, does your investigation relate directly to the testimony given today? Yes, Your Honor. Then the court will hear the relevant evidence. Naomi nodded once. Thank you. She turned toward the courtroom clerk, who accepted a sealed evidence folder from a federal investigator entering quietly through the side door. The investigator wore a dark business suit rather than tactical gear. There was nothing dramatic about his appearance. That made his presence even more unsettling. He approached the bench, presented official documentation, and stepped back without a word. Judge Benson reviewed the first page carefully. His expression changed almost immediately. He continued reading in complete silence before placing the documents on the bench. The record will reflect that these materials were obtained pursuant to federal authorization. A murmur swept across the gallery. Reporters reached for their phones. Pens moved rapidly across notebooks. Ethan's attorney stood. Your Honor, may we review these exhibits before they are discussed? You will have that opportunity. Naomi remained calm. There is no need for speculation, she said. The documents speak for themselves. She pressed a small remote resting on the counsel table. A courtroom monitor illuminated. The screen displayed a timeline. Dates. Locations. Case numbers. Nothing sensational. Only an orderly sequence of events. Each entry corresponded with incidents Ethan had described during his testimony. Then another column appeared. Digital logs. Radio transmissions. Official reports. Security records. Every item aligned with the timeline. Except one. The statement Ethan had sworn to only an hour earlier. Naomi looked toward the screen. The timeline demonstrates where Officer Walker claimed to be. She allowed a brief pause. The supporting records demonstrate where he actually was. No accusation. No raised voice. Just comparison. The courtroom understood immediately. Judge Benson adjusted his glasses and studied the display again. Ethan shifted uneasily. His confidence had disappeared. For the first time that day, he avoided looking at the jury. Naomi continued. An investigation is rarely solved by one dramatic discovery. It is solved by consistent facts that refuse to contradict each other. She glanced toward Ethan. Today, the evidence remained consistent. Another federal investigator entered quietly and handed the prosecutor a certified packet. Inside were authenticated transcripts and digital verification records. The prosecutor read the cover page. His expression hardened. He slowly closed the folder. "Your Honor," he said, "the government requests that these exhibits be admitted into the record." Judge Benson nodded. "So ordered." The gavel struck once. It was a simple sound. Yet everyone in the courtroom understood its significance. Moments earlier, Officer Ethan Walker had relied on confidence to shape the narrative. Now the narrative belonged to documented facts. And facts, unlike fear or reputation, required no persuasion to be believed. No one in courtroom 7 looked at Officer Ethan Walker the same way again. The uniform that had commanded unquestioned respect only an hour earlier now seemed strangely ordinary. The polished badge remained pinned to his chest, but it no longer carried the authority that had once filled the room. Authority without credibility was nothing more than polished metal. Judge Harold Benson reviewed the newly admitted exhibits one final time before placing them neatly on the bench. The record reflects substantial inconsistencies between the witness's testimony and the authenticated evidence submitted today. His words were calm. They didn't need to be louder. The truth had already done the difficult work. Ethan's attorney rose slowly. "Your Honor, my client requests an opportunity to clarify portions of his testimony." The judge looked toward Ethan. "You may." For several long seconds, Ethan said nothing. His eyes moved from the evidence screen to the jury, then to Naomi Brooks, who remained standing quietly beside the counsel table. When he finally spoke, the confidence that had defined his testimony was gone. "I may have misunderstood certain events." No one reacted. The explanation sounded small compared to the weight of the evidence. Naomi remained silent. She had not spent months gathering documents simply to win an argument. She had gathered them to establish facts. The prosecutor stepped forward. "Your Honor, the government requests permission to present additional certified records that directly address the witness's sworn statements." Granted. Another folder was handed to the clerk. Inside were communication logs, official dispatch records, and signed certifications verifying their authenticity. Each document confirmed the same conclusion. The timeline Ethan described under oath could not have occurred as he claimed. A juror slowly removed his glasses and rubbed his eyes before reading the displayed timeline again. Another juror quietly shook her head. The realization spread without anyone speaking it aloud. This was no longer a disagreement over memory. It was a question of accountability. Judge Benson folded his hands. "Officer Walker, do you wish to amend any portion of your testimony before this hearing proceeds further?" Ethan opened his mouth. Nothing came out. For the first time in years, he had no version of events capable of surviving documented evidence. Naomi finally spoke. Her voice remained measured. This investigation was never about proving that one person could make a mistake. She looked briefly toward the jury. It was about determining whether the truth could withstand careful examination. The courtroom remained silent. Outside, the afternoon sun reflected against the courthouse windows, casting long beams of light across the polished floor. Inside, the atmosphere had completely transformed. Hours earlier, many people had assumed Naomi Brooks needed to defend herself. Now no defense was necessary. The document spoke with greater clarity than any witness ever could. Judge Benson closed the final exhibit folder. The court will refer these materials for appropriate review and further proceedings consistent with federal law. The gavel struck once. Its sound echoed through the chamber. Not as a celebration. Not as revenge. But as a reminder that justice is strongest when it depends neither on status nor on reputation. Only on the facts that remain standing after every assumption has fallen. The courthouse emptied more slowly than it had filled that morning. Reporters remained on the front steps, speaking into cameras as employees carried boxes of documents between offices. Attorneys discussed the hearing in quiet conversations that would continue long after sunset. For many people, it had been another remarkable day inside a federal courtroom. For Naomi Brooks, it was simply the completion of an assignment. She walked through the marble hallway carrying the same leather portfolio she had brought with her that morning. Nothing about her appearance had changed. Only the way people looked at her. Court employees who had barely noticed her hours earlier now stepped aside with quiet respect. A few offered polite nods. Others simply watched her pass, still trying to understand how an ordinary-looking observer had become the central figure in one of the courthouse's most unforgettable hearings. Naomi acknowledged no attention. She had never accepted the assignment for recognition. Outside the courtroom, one of the federal investigators caught up with her. "The paperwork is complete," he said. She nodded. "And Officer Walker?" "The administrative process has already begun." She looked toward the courthouse entrance where afternoon sunlight spilled across the stone floor. "There are still more interviews," the investigator added. "There always are," Naomi replied. She knew the investigation had never depended on a single witness. Nor had it depended on one dramatic courtroom revelation. Justice was rarely built in moments. It was built in patient decisions repeated over time. Back inside courtroom 7, the wooden benches were nearly empty. Judge Harold Benson remained alone for a few minutes, reviewing the final pages of the record before closing the file. Every hearing told a story. Some ended with celebration. Others ended with disappointment. Today's hearing ended with a reminder. Titles could earn respect. Uniforms could command attention. But neither could rewrite the truth once evidence began to speak. Outside, Ethan Walker left the courthouse through a different exit. Gone was the confident stride that had carried him into the building earlier that morning. His shoulders were lower. His expression quieter. For the first time in years, he understood what it felt like to stand on the opposite side of unquestioned assumptions. No cameras followed him. No crowd confronted him. Only silence accompanied each step. Sometimes silence was the loudest consequence of all. Naomi paused at the top of the courthouse steps before looking back one final time. The building behind her stood exactly as it had at sunrise. Stone. Glass. Steel. Unmoved by emotion. Its purpose had never been to favor one person over another. Its purpose was to examine facts. She smiled faintly before disappearing into the flow of pedestrians crossing the city plaza. By evening, the headlines would focus on the courtroom surprise. People would remember the FBI badge. They would remember the evidence. They would remember the officer whose testimony unraveled before their eyes. But the lesson reached further than one courtroom or one investigation. Power may influence first impressions. Prejudice may shape first judgments. But neither is stronger than the truth when it is supported by patience, integrity, and undeniable evidence. Because a badge can open a door. Only honesty can stand when every door has finally been opened.